Well, there will be now more investigation into these bank accounts and whether there's any suggestion of illegality. We keep stressing that Swiss bank accounts per se doesn't mean there's any illegality, let alone any tax avoidance. But that's the question. Now, Ed Miliband tried to do two different things, didn't he, at Prime Minister Questions? One thing that has nothing to do with these revelations, which was why didn't the Prime Minister ask the questions he could have asked before he appointed Stephen Green? We've heard the Prime Minister's defence that he sought advice of the Lords Appointments Committee. They only looked into the now Lord Green's own tax affairs, we know. They didn't look into what he knew about other people's tax affairs when he was head of HSBC Bank. He sought the advice of the Cabinet Secretary. He sought the advice of another propriety committee as well. He repeatedly wouldn't answer Labour MPs' questions, who are obviously put up by their whips to ask it again and again, as to whether he had had any conversations with Lord Green about this story once it got into the public domain. Separately, though, I thought it was quite striking that Labour came back to that. We've had these massive revelations, but they came back to what was in effect an old story at the end of Prime Minister's Questions. On the revelations themselves about donors having Swiss bank accounts, you know, the language used by Ed Miliband was the strongest I've heard in years. Up to his neck, dodgy Prime Minister surrounded by dodgy donors. He's banged to rights. Let's be clear, he was trying to use the language, you know, that you'd use in a pub or a workplace to suggest wrongdoing, criminality. Now, he is able to do that because he's protected by parliamentary privilege. Were he to say that in a television studio, he would be in a rather more interesting position.
Learned
with
friends
lawyers,
would be interested,
I think, to use language of that sort, particularly in the context of naming anybody. So there's definitely an attempt to imply that there has been serious wrongdoing and that there's a link between that and a failure to act strongly, but there was no new evidence of that wrongdoing.
Let's come back to who knew what when. Nick Gibb, this list was stolen in 2007. And by 2010, it was well known that the French had it. And it was a matter of public record. Mr. Green wasn't appointed until 2011. So surely it beggars belief that ministers didn't know the existence of a Swiss list under his watch.
They knew of the existence of the list and they knew that HSBC was the bank, but they did not know that any complicity in encouraging or advising tax evasion was taking place. There is a convention that the HMRC does not tell ministers details of individual taxpayers.
No, I'm not asking about that. I'm not asking about that. This is a list. Don't forget, this is also a list that in 2010, HSBC fought a fierce court case in Paris to stop the French authorities handing this list to HMRC in London. That was reported in the Financial Times and other places. They lost. Wouldn't that alert you, the fact that HSBC was fighting that? Wouldn't that alert you to the fact that you needed to discuss this with Mr. Green first?
No, because there's nothing illegal in having a Swiss bank account. The illegality and the complicity of HSBC has only just been revealed, and that's from the evidence of the emails and so on advising their clients. So there was no reason not to appoint Stephen Green in 2010,
But why wouldn't
2011.
you get that assurance from him first?
Because they've no need to ask him this. He was the chief executive of one of Britain's leading businesses, a major bank around the world. This man has written books about morality in banking. There was no reason to ask him, had his bank engaged in any kind of illegal activity?
But this was a secret list. This was a secret list. And everybody knows what happens in Switzerland. You'd have to be incredibly incurious not to say to Mr. Green at the time, look, this list that you are fighting to stop being handed to HMRC, is there any chance that a lot of people on that are evading tax? Why would you not ask Mr. Green that question?
Well, HMRC have gone through every line in that list and they have worked out whether they are legitimate account holders, like the statement you've had today, or whether they lived in Switzerland and so on. Those that are not have had their tax demanded. £135 million has been recovered, plus penalties, and we doubled the quantum of penalties.
Only one prosecution.
Yes, but what we want is the tax back. That's the approach HMRC
No, but
take.
that's an entirely different issue. I'm just I don't understand why it wouldn't raise alarm bells that the chief executive of Britain's biggest bank, a list has been stolen from their Geneva office. It's now in the hands of the French, who have begun prosecutions against it. It is now being handed over, despite HSBC's objections, to the British tax authorities, that would not be worth a conversation with Mr. Green to find out what his position was on that before you made him a government minister.
No banks want to protect the privacy of their clients. There was no evidence that HSBC at that time was complicit in tax evasion.
Well, how did you know if you hadn't asked Mr. Green?
Well, because you can't ask questions when you don't have any evidence on which to base the question. You can't ask the chief executive of a food company whether they have any horse meat in their food. You have to have evidence. This era, by the way,
not if you're appointing a government minister.
No, well, he went through the due diligence. His own personal tax affairs were questioned, but there was no evidence on which to. So that's why he was appointed. He was a very good minister. He had a very strong reputation in the city. That's why he was an advisor to Labour. The question Labour needs to ask,
can I ask the question?
Well, she was a minister at the time in 2007. This period relates to 05 to 07, and there was a culture under the last Labour government of poor regulation across the banking sector.
All right, let me come to. I don't want to ask you about 2005 to 2007 because I think it's very hard to know that in a private bank in Geneva that you would know what bank accounts were. Whether the regulation, right, that's another issue. What I want to ask you is this, though. In 2010, since it was well known that this list existed, that this list was in the hands of the French, and it was also well known that HMRC had fought a court case to get it from France into Britain, when Mr. Green was appointed, why didn't you raise it?
I have no idea why that wasn't raised when he was appointed. All I can say
it was a matter of public record.
All I can say is what we've got here is some very convenient incuriosity about people who ran institutions like banks,
including your own, because Labour didn't bother to raise it.
We've got to also recognise that the tax gap has actually widened, not closed, under this government.
That's not the question.
And we've got to have a look.
Was it a mistake, given what we knew in 2010, that you, as the opposition, I don't mean you personally, but the Labour opposition did not raise a question mark? Indeed, far from raising a question mark, you included him in a trade mission led by Chuka Umunna.
Well, look, I think the important thing is that we've got to get to the bottom of what's gone on. We've got to find out whether HMRC have done their job properly.
We all agree with that. I'm asking you. I mean, it seems to me, I think anybody watching would think that both Labour and Conservative were complicit in allowing this appointment to go ahead.
We were not in government. We did not make the decision to appoint.
It's your job to ask questions.
We did not make the decision to appoint this man. We raised some issues about the tax gap and some of the issues around offshoring at the time. If you look at what our Treasury team were doing.
You just didn't raise the question of Mr. Green.
The issue of this investigation in HSBC was known about when Labour were in government, because the HMRC, the revenue as we used to call it, the taxman, asked for the data in February 2010. The election was in May. The data arrived on May the 1st, 2010, admittedly terribly close to the election.
After a court case that had been covered.
But my point is that Treasury ministers under Labour, just like Treasury ministers under the Tories after May 2010, would have been very well aware that there were issues around. What I think both sides are in a sense able to say is there's a difference between knowing Swiss bank accounts raise all sorts of issues about whether tax is being avoided, and what was revealed on Monday by the BBC's Panorama programme is that the bank was itself involved in advising people to break the law. Not everyone, not all the people named, but were involved in advising people, and that is the significance. I think what's interesting at the end, just very briefly, at the end of Prime Minister's questions, is there's not a focus, and that's what Ed Miliband will now be frustrated about. If you've had a really successful Prime Minister's questions, everyone goes, that's the point. Now, clearly, there'll be a lot of people who say there's a lot of rich people, it all works well for them, the Tories are in charge, and Labour will be able to use that. It's a powerful argument.
Are they being called before the committee?
There is a lack of a single focus question.
Right, thank you for that. Since I think it was HSBC that helped the Mexican drug cartel launder money, why would it not help Swiss tax evaders? Nick, thank you very much.